If Leviticus is the deathbed of many a read the Bible in a year resolution, I reckon that Job is generally just ignored or never reached, which is both a pity and quite understandable. Happening to read it in the last month or so with my 11-year-old daughter Rebecca, I've really been struck, however, by its relevance as wisdom for our time, and not just the first couple of chapters, a few memory verses in the middle, and the last bit. Let me back up. Reading the Bible with Rebecca has been quite interesting. There's always some good interaction, even if brief, and having directed what we read for most of her 10 years of hearing the Bible, I've let her have a bit of limited choice in what we'll do, and she's been interested in getting into hitherto uncharted territory. For us, that's meant that we finally tackled a mostly uncensored Judges, really not safe for work, and we're now in Job. I'll be honest. I actually had only ever skimmed through Job. I found the endless poetic arguing to be rather tiresome, weird, and maybe it just didn't seem wildly relevant, apart from a little bit about suffering, which we all do endure. If Job is preached as somewhat like Daniel and Revelation, you tend to get just the juicy bits and skim over or summarize the rest, perhaps the way that people often think of the poetry bits in The Lord of the Rings. You see, alongside the Bible, we're also on our third read through of The Lord of the Rings as a bedtime story, which we began doing when she was 6 or 7, I think, paused a little and then resumed when at age 8 she could handle it better. I confess, I sing most of the songs, and Rebecca puts up with it. In fact, she seems to actually quite like it, and I actually enjoy them. But when I read The Lord of the Rings to myself, I always skipped them over. It seemed to go on for ages. So why did I do that? And why do I actually quite enjoy singing them now? And why is it that so many people have had bad experiences of slaving away over poetry at school? Well, I'm starting to appreciate that almost always poetry really absolutely must be heard and not just read silently. In fact, more than that, it must be performed. In poetry, the sounds and rhythms of the words and lines are considerably more significant than the sounds and rhythms of the words in prose, whether story, teaching, or conversation. I guess that's obvious, and probably everyone knows that. But this means that unless you actually hear it out loud and take the time to get the rhythm right, you're not actually experiencing the poetry properly, in the same way that if you removed all the conjunctions, tense, and sentence divisions from a story, you'd still have the same story, but without most of the spice that makes it worth listening to. As you hear the rhythms and rhyme, the assonances and alliterations in poetry, certainly in English anyway, probably in most languages, they combine with the figurative language that most people think of characterizing poetry, and the reordering and filling in what is left unsaid to give, when done well, a more powerful communication than prose could achieve. It does require some hard work to appreciate all that the poet has woven into it, but hearing it aloud makes it come alive. I guess prose really survives silent reading more successfully and with less loss. Poetry read badly, too, is incoherent and annoying to try to follow. Incidentally, I find poetry translated prosaically or being printed as poetic lines is infuriatingly disappointing. And so actually I found myself agreeing with the original New Living Translation decision to print much of Old Testament poetry as prose. Because aside from figurative language, the translation was prosaic, without distinctive rhythm or rhyme. Being told something is poetic, while it doesn't sound it, is rather like Alice in Wonderland's sad song about the beautiful soup. You know that sad, sad song, beautiful soup. It really doesn't add up. Right, end of rant. And so back to Job. Most of Job is apparently poetry. Now, poetry in the Bible is an acquired taste, it must be said, and even more so than talking. And I think it can be read fairly well, whatever the translation. What Rebecca has found quite striking about Job so far is that it's really not very like many other books of the Bible at all. Perhaps like the Gospels and some of the parable stories in the Gospels, you get straight into the story, and then the action happens rather swiftly, and before you know it, you're sitting in the dust with Job, wondering Whether he'll take his wife's advice and curse God to finish it all, on the face of it, everything is actually very clear, and yet we quickly discover that things may not be all as they seem. Of course, the introduction to righteous Job sounds as over the top as Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, or the lost sons, and it could be too easy to get hung up on whether he was quite as good as he is claimed to be. That may be a distraction, I think, and also actually cunningly part of the wisdom already at work. Job is quite clearly in the wisdom category as far as books go. It sits right alongside the parable of the Good Samaritan and others, with a deeply subversive and possibly disturbing message or messages, which I think we too easily miss. Job's friends come along to comfort him. Isn't that kind? And when they speak, it sounds right. And yet it's not very helpful to Job. They basically find various different ways to lay into him for obviously having sinned. Since he is suffering, he must have done something wrong. And these are Pharisees or prosperity teachers before their time. They would really fit well into the kick a man when he's down Twitterverse. Raised on the simplicity of Proverbs style logic about sin, you, shockingly, almost get the feeling that they delight in Job's downfall. But if that wasn't enough, it's Job's answers to his friends which are really seriously unsettling. Rebecca has raised a figurative eyebrow more than once. He shouldn't really say that to or about God, should he? So here's the conundrum. We have a main protagonist who we've been told very clearly at the start is righteous, in a very good place with God, and very careful to do whatever he can, even to cover unintentional sins by his family. He is unrealistically pure and without a hint of virtue signalling show-off attitude. He doesn't boast about his actions, he just does the right thing. And then his friends say things that sound very acceptable to a conservative or charismatic ear. And yet we know from the start and the end that they're barking up the wrong tree. Honest Job then says all kinds of shocking things to and about God and seems to get away with it. His friends are shocked. We are shocked. But God doesn't seem to be shocked. The narrator just lets the ding-dong battle continue. I'm not allowing any spoilers at the moment with Rebecca, not really. Perhaps the occasional cryptic hint that we need to suspend judgment here about who's right. That's all. So, what's the effect? Well, I think it's worth taking time to read it all the way through. I think we're rightly shocked at what Job says, and 24 chapters in, we're getting sick and tired of the trite but maybe well-intentioned nonsense his friends are spouting. We know Job hasn't sinned. It was absolutely clear at the start. The accusations are as ridiculous as spurious witchcraft allegations which still abound in many parts of Africa. Like Jesus with the blind man in John's Gospel in chapter 9, we know that in this particular case, suffering is not a proof of his sin. He is not a witch in African terms. He is not guilty. We have it from God. The friends' view of the world clearly asserts that if someone sins, then they suffer. So if someone suffers, it's because they sinned. Or, and this is a fantastic get out, maybe their parents sinned. Karma, easy. And now the children are paying for it. That is brilliant as an argument because it's virtually impossible to disprove. So we end up driven to distraction by the crass yet confident attempts of the friends to distort reality to fit their limited perspective. God save us from this. Isn't it so easy to end up doing that, though? Let's just think about our world at the moment. It's gone crazy. We live in a world where people are vigorously sharing opinions all the time. I'm doing it right now. And we live in a world where many people claim to know what is what, and where considerable truth gets blended with inappropriate application or cunning falsehood. This calls for wisdom. Even respected teachers slip up. We shouldn't be surprised. We would do well to recognise that we ourselves are often playing the part of Job's comforters. I think the message of Job is a call for humility and to check that we are really speaking God's message and not just our culture-tamed caricature of it, and thinking Christianly about the ups and downs and our partial understanding of this world. If there are many questions at this time, there are more than enough answers. Job himself, I think, calls us away from seeking answers or blame to seeking real engagement with God. Seeking not to extract answers or blessing from God, but seeking connection with God to see us through. Away with the clever retorts and smart put-downs. Surely you are the people and wisdom will die with you. Whenever Job was written, his glimpses of God so clearly find a tremendous fulfillment in Jesus. It's not just that Jesus is the answer in a trite or superficial way, but that given what we know about Jesus, we can look at Job's shocking, desperate crying out to God, and we can say that his attitude was largely right, even if his knowledge and understanding was limited. He's right to focus his attention on God as his Redeemer, not on his works of the law to sort everything out. In truth, not even the people researching COVID-19 and possible vaccines and medicines know very much about the virus, and certainly not the politicians and media stars who fill our public discourse. So as Christians, we may want to just keep back a little when people play the blame game. You know, people blaming politicians for not acting fast enough, not having enough masks in place, ventilators, or everyone blaming Donald Trump, and Donald Trump blaming everyone else. Is there any wisdom from Job and from Jesus? Well, here's a paraphrase you might recognize. Some people told him about the old people with underlying health conditions who had died from COVID-19, and Jesus said, do you think it was because they lived unhealthy lives and had illicit social contact instead of isolating that they died of COVID? Were they worse sinners because they died in this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. Based on Luke chapter 13. Our world will quickly rush to blame someone or to argue about that kind of thing, and Jesus is very clear. Take the warning and make sure you're in a good place with God. After all, Easter is a great reminder that Jesus has flung wide the gates for us to come in. Job and people like him would have longed to see the day when God came to live with us in Jesus. What are we waiting for? This life is not all there is. As much as we might long for some sense of justice, we shouldn't be shocked when we don't see it. And yet we can trust that God is truly in charge and will make all things right in the end. We don't need to protect God from accusations of injustice, or like Job's friends, or like some climate alarmists, to anxiously find a reason to make people wallow in guilt, but to encourage everyone to entrust themselves to God and value him above all the gifts he sends us. Jesus the Son guarantees us relationship by his Holy Spirit. The promise is for us and for our children. So let's not be surprised when even sound folk propagate solid-sounding fake news about God. And if we don't understand what's going on, that's okay. We can take it to God and recognize him as ultimately responsible. That's actually okay. We don't even need to blame the devil. Job never knew what the devil had been up to behind the scenes. He didn't need to know what had gone on in heaven. He just needed to cling to God. He came to realize that, and God confirmed it in the end, didn't he? We need to cling to God, don't we?